When you think of a typical process for an illustration, it's like a collection of building blocks that make up that entire illustration. There's a practical way the methods in this video can be applied to any workflow, but I need to explain my process first, because this isn't about just my process. This is about designing your workflow that works for you and how to do that. I haven't done characters in a while, and as I was thinking why this is, I realized that I just didn't like my process for making them. But this isn't a channel about complaining creative problems, this is about solutions. So I decided to break apart my own workflow and experiment with different ways to do lines and line art, and at the same time see if shuffling these pieces around would make a difference to how I feel about the work itself. It has to be mentioned here that doing art for YouTube or social media, it's not the perfect place to experiment and learn to do new things. So I promised myself that I would keep my options open for whatever crazy ideas might come to me through this process. The biggest change was the sketch itself. This is not the sketch. This is the sketch. I remembered one super fun life drawing class that I did with oils in art school. For some reason, it was so much more natural to me to sketch with paint than with lines, so I decided to try that, but now in digital form. For me, this was just a much faster way to try different ideas really quickly, and I didn't commit to the composition or the pose of the character before I had gone through different options. I'm very slow at drawing, so this is an alternative I'm definitely going to experiment more with. Out of all the experiments that I'm going to do in this video, this is the one that I'm definitely going to research more and find a way to fit it into my workflow in these sort of illustrations. After I was done with this silhouette, I used Find Edges filter in Photoshop. It turns any silhouettes or pools of color into lines. This is what I started to draw on. I'm using an A3 paper, somebody was asking about that in the comments when I'm drawing, and that is because it's really tricky for my shaky hands to do tiny little details in small scale, and having a bit more of that extra room, it just makes those tiny jitters of my hand less distracting for the final drawing. One area where this still caused a lot of trouble for me was this girl's face. I ended up redrawing parts of it digitally because I wanted her eyes to be open in the final version. I mean, she's already kind of doing distracted driving, I guess, here because she's texting at the same time. I guess I thought that at least she should keep her eyes open to see what she's writing on that phone. Usually in my drawings I do a second round of line art, and this is just to redraw lines that I want to appear thicker, and it's usually around objects or silhouettes of different elements. But this time, instead of doing that, I duplicated the layer that had the lines on it, and on this duplication I added a small Gaussian blur, and that thickened the lines. And then I used a layer mask, and then I just painted into visibility those areas where I wanted the lines to appear thicker. I don't know why I haven't done this before, because honestly it saves so much time. I still ended up fine-tuning some corners with digital pencil, but honestly in like 80% of cases, just this semi-automated method, it was enough, and I honestly can't tell the difference. When drawing on paper, I think it leaves this really nice gritty texture to the lines that I really like. Usually I tend to push back the line art in my illustrations, but this time I did the exact opposite. I added a lot less shading than I normally do. The contrast was just not as stark, and even the deepest shadows are quite light. This is also because I drew this in a bit different way. The idea to draw the lines this way came from really old C maps, where they have those really small, ornate mini pictures to them that make those maps look really decorative. I don't know why old maps were made that pretty and why they aren't anymore, but they had this line technique that I found interesting, and I wanted to bring that into the lines that suggest form. It's almost like shading, but half like suggested lines. What you don't see in this video is that this way of doing these sort of like mini shading areas wasn't in any way easy for me, and I tried adding lines, for example, for the entire background too. I tried it several times with different techniques, but nothing seemed to be quite right, and in the end it seemed like a better idea to let the illustration breathe a little bit, so I left that area empty. But I just wanted to be honest that not everything is going to work out. So I guess an important lesson here is just time and patience. When learning and experimenting with new things, I don't expect everything to just automatically work. There will be dead ends and failures, but when I start an illustration with this mindset of trying something new, I know to expect that those problems will occur, and getting frustrated about those wouldn't help anything, so I try my best not to let those moments stop me from working and progressing. Basically, when you're experimenting, you have to allow for extra time for those dead ends to happen, because that is part of the process. I feel like I should say a few words about this witch. For whatever reason, I didn't want this to look like some kind of a high fantasy piece, even though she's literally flying on a broom. I don't know why I felt this way. I thought that maybe she's texting her friends some kind of an excuse why she's been away and telling them that she can't make it to some party because she's in this location far away. Her friends probably don't know that she's also a witch. I designed her outfit so that it looks partly like a school outfit, but it also has a bit of like militaristic uniform look to it. This hints to me that this magic school that she's also attending maybe has a dangerous aspect to it, and that's why she's not telling her friends that she has this whole other life that they don't know about. Shoes aren't always part of the school's dress code, so I wanted to give her something that would work in both settings. As I was working on this piece, the idea of her living in two worlds like this sounded kind of lonely because she can't tell her friends about this whole other aspect about herself, so I had to give her a cat to keep her company. The cat turned out quite chunky, but I kind of like this chunky cat. Now, I know that cats can't be trusted, but at least this one doesn't talk, so it's fine. But all witches need a black cat, right? Isn't that like one of the first things that they hand you when you enter a magic school, right? Anyway, as the colors started shaping into very uncommercial, muted palette, I thought it would be cool to give the whole image a frame like some kind of a trading card illustration. That's something that I've always wanted to do, and this seemed like a perfect opportunity to do that. For this decorative frame, I did a loose mess of lines, and then I used my less angry pencil brush to draw in the cleaner version of that mess. To make this, I used Symmetry tool, which helped me see the whole frame in real time and how it would look when mirrored on the other side. I have done these sort of elements in the past by just drawing half of it by hand traditionally and then adding horizontally flipped copy to the piece on the other side. Now, this sounds easy enough on paper, but at least for me, in my experience, whenever I do the flipped horizontal version, it's always kind of a negative surprise how those copies work together. So unless you have an actual physical mirror with you at all times when you are drawing this other side, I kind of like doing this part digitally more, because it allows me to see both sides as I work on it, and especially that center area where those two sides meet, that was much easier to design, and I think that I did that more effectively by using this method of using the mirror tool in Procreate. For the colors, I'm using my cotton candy brush. It's still available for the channel members until the 15th of November. For these colors, I didn't have any real plan when I started. The only thing that I wanted to avoid is giving the skin too much shading and contrast, because I knew that that would lead into my line art sinking into the shadows in the darker areas of this illustration. Because if I give the skin a lot of shading, then I need to do so also in areas that have deep dark shadows. Some have asked me advice on how to use this cotton candy brush. It's probably more simple than you would think. I use it normally when painting smaller areas, but in big spaces I use my stylus almost sideways to get those nice paper textures and watercolor look more visible. The whole sky in this painting is just layering brushstrokes of different hues with the same values on top of each other by having the stylus in this tilted angle. That's how I get that warm blue look. That area where the color looks like it's blue, but because it has layers of brushstrokes done with complementary colors on top of it, it can look blue and warm at the same time, which I know doesn't sound like it makes sense, but I think it works and it gives this rich color to that area. Some people call this simultaneous contrast. One of my art teachers called it ringing color. In my own words, I have often spoken on this channel about empty calorie colors, and empty calorie colors are basically an opposite of this. When you just fill an area with a paint bucket and you just have this one flat color, it doesn't give your eye anything to process or to look at. So you kind of just tend to move on to some areas that are more interesting. So I call those empty calorie colors. Sometimes flat colors are fine, but I think the whole texture is a really big element of this whole painting, so it wouldn't fit here, in my opinion. Lines drawn with the stylus can easily look a bit out of place when combined with traditional pencil line art, but I've recently used this one trick where I color select a very limited range of values from just an empty piece of paper, and then I use that as a grainy selection to break apart my digital lines. For this to work, I kept the digital lines and traditional lines on different layers and did this editing trick in Photoshop in the final editing phase. Sadly, Procreate doesn't have select by color yet. I really hope that they put this in someday, even if it's more of an editing and not a painting tool. Both of these line art layers are in normal blend mode. I don't like to use multiply blend mode for line art because it can be quite limiting. With normal blend mode, you can color the lines whatever you want, and I use this around some softer elements to give them less contrast. In the end, I now see that some parts of this process could definitely be improved upon, especially that sketching phase. The sketch that I did in the beginning made drawing a bit harder than necessary because I had shading there, and that stuff wasn't helpful information for the forms at all. But if I had not tried this, I would have no way of knowing how to improve this part of the process. Now obviously I can't recommend techniques to anyone else that I'm just now discovering myself, because that would be pretty irresponsible. I can, however, highly recommend using this way of improving your process. And here comes the actionable part of this video. Remember those building blocks that I mentioned in the beginning? Every phase of your normal workflow is one of those building blocks. But it's important to remember that every step of almost any workflow is not set in stone. It can be replaced by almost endless amount of options. So those building blocks can be changed to other building blocks like I have done throughout this entire process. This is also exactly how I discovered that workflow for architecture that I showed in this video. I didn't just randomly stumble upon that sequence of methods. I replaced every single part of that process until I felt completely comfortable with the process, so that it feels not only efficient for me to get to that end result, but more importantly, I found a combination of elements that I actually like to work on. When I said in that video that I have done that process hundreds of times, I wasn't kidding. I just love going through those steps so much that it just doesn't get boring ever for me. And this is why it's so important to examine your workflow and see if there are alternatives to it that can make it feel more fun and enjoyable or efficient for you. About this witch, I hope that she decides to go to that party. It's good to have friends even when they don't fully know you. I'm Mikko, and I hope you go out and explore different ways of drawing to find a way that feels fun for you, because that way I'm sure we'll see even more of your art. I'll see you guys in the next video, especially if you press all of those buttons. Or don't, I'm not here to tell you what to do. Bye!